Welcome to Marking the End Times. I'm Dr. Mark Hitchcock, and this is a program that's designed to help you understand current events in light of Bible prophecy, what the scriptures tell us about what the world will look like in the end times. Today on this program, what I want to discuss is, since Christmas is this coming weekend, I want to talk about some myths and misunderstandings about Christmas. And a few of these are related as well to some prophecies that are given in the Old Testament. But I love this time of year. It's my favorite time of the year. I'm sure it is for many of us. And there are a lot of great traditions that have arisen around Christmas, even the time that we celebrate it. Some of these are very good. They're right. Some of them aren't as accurate. And so I want to answer some questions just about a lot of myths and misunderstandings kind of surrounding the birth of Jesus. And then I'm going to answer in the subscriber section, I'm going to answer a really important question about the time of Jesus' birth around December 25th and how that could be related or not to a lot of pagan traditions. A lot of people think that we shouldn't celebrate Christmas because of that. I want to answer another really good question about finding a good church. A person's asking, how do I find, what should I look for to find a really good Bible-based church? And so we'll be looking at that as well in our question and answer section. Also a question about the Jewish people in the time of the tribulation. But let's get into some of these questions about the Christmas season. This time of year, we hear the Christmas story read over and over again, Luke chapter 2. A lot of us will go to Christmas programs at our churches. And there's a lot of different points, kind of finer points about the Christmas story that I think it's important for us to understand to give us a fuller understanding of the incarnation of Jesus. Let me just begin. I've got about 4 or 5 of these to go through, and then I'll address one of these in the subscriber section. But the first one is that one of the most familiar passages we hear during the Christmas season is Luke chapter 2, verse 7. That Mary took the baby Jesus, she laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. And so when you go to a lot of Christmas programs or, pageants, I remember when I was growing up, we'd have these plays at church, and you always had Joseph and Mary kind of trudging up to the local hotel, and they knock on the door, and you always had this kind of, the grumpy innkeeper who would come there and tell them there was no room in the inn and would turn them away. Well, that makes for a great play, but that's really not what happened, I think, at the first Christmas. The word that's used there, and again, a lot of translations have the word inn, but it's the Greek word kataluma. We know that it doesn't really mean inn. It means something more like a guest room or the spare room. That in Luke's gospel, over in Luke chapter 10 and verse 34, Luke uses the word there that's the more specific word for an inn. That's the story about the parable of the Good Samaritan. Remember, he finds this man who's been beaten and bloodied, and he takes him to an inn, or like what in that day would have been like a modern day hotel or a motel. And so that's the word he uses in Luke 10:34 for an inn. But in Luke 2:7, it's this word kataluma, which again probably just means like a guest room or the spare room. So with the census that was taking place, a lot of relatives of Joseph and Mary would have been going to the area of Bethlehem, those from the family of David. So they're probably going to plan on staying there with a relative, but the time they get there, it may have been late at night, there was no room for them in the guest room or the spare room. So it says that Jesus was laid in a manger. Back in that day, the main part of a house would have an area where the stable was not far from there. And a lot of times the animals, if it was cold, would even come into that area at night. And so a manger back in that day, we think of kind of a little wooden box, but a manger in that day was literally, it was like a limestone feeding trough for animals, made of limestone and kind of hewn out a little bit. And so Jesus was laid there in this feeding trough. So we know there were animals around. So it could have been in the main part of the home there, or it may have been in a detached stable. And again, the tradition is it was in a cave. So this kind of detached stable area could have been a cave there as well. But, again, we don't want to have this idea of the knocking on the door of the inn. It just, when they got there was no room in the spare room for them or the guest room. Now, I've often wondered, why didn't the people, since Mary's so pregnant, why didn't the people in the guest room give up the guest room or the spare room for Mary and Joseph? Well, they could have gotten there late at night. Back in that day, you have to remember, houses were crammed full of people. And so they didn't want to disrupt the whole household, so there was no room left there. So they just went down into the main part of the house or in this detached stable or cave area. So that helps us understand, I think, this idea about the inn. Another interesting point in Matthew's gospel, in Matthew chapter 2, of the wise men is the star. In Matthew chapter 2 and verse 2, the wise men come, and it said, they said, "Where is he who's been born King of the Jews? We've seen his star in the east, and we've come to worship him." Which is interesting. Those are the only words of the wise men we have in Scripture. So that they've come from the east, probably over in the area of Persia or near Babylon, maybe Parthia. They've traveled a long distance, and they said, "We saw his star in the east, and we've come to worship him." Now, I think this is a fulfillment of an Old Testament prophecy. Back in Numbers chapter 24, verse 17, when Balaam, the pagan prophet, was speaking, he gives a prophecy that a star will come out of Jacob. And so this is a fulfillment of that prophecy related to Jesus, probably that these ancient astrologers knew from these ancient writings, these ancient Jewish writings. So they see this star and they believe it's significant. But I don't think this is just any star, because when you go down a little bit further in the passage, they talk to Herod and to the Jewish scholars, and they find out that this Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. So they make their way there, and it says in chapter 2, verse 8 of Luke's gospel, or of Matthew's gospel, he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. When you found him, report to me that I may come and worship him." And after hearing the king, they went their way, and listen to this, the star which they had seen in the east went on before them. So it appears to me that they hadn't seen the star since they left the east. So they traveled by faith. They'd seen it there, and it had guided them to Israel, but now they see it again because they rejoice exceedingly with great joy. So I think the star here was not a heavenly body. It's not some star in the sky. The word aster, the Greek word here, can be used symbolically or figuratively. Like in Revelation 22:16, Jesus is called the bright and morning star. Well, obviously, he's not a star. He's not some star in the heavens. He's bright and luminous in his being. So I think this star here was this aster, this shining, was the Shekinah glory of God. The word Shekinah, the Hebrew word, means like a dwelling or a presence. It's the settled presence of God. And so I think God's glory appeared to these wise men in the east. And they realized that something was happening. God may have given them some direction, some message. They traveled all the way to Jerusalem because they think surely that's where the Messiah, this Jewish king, would be born. But they find out it's about 5 miles away in Bethlehem. And then it says that the star which they'd seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. Again, it'd be hard for a heavenly body to direct you to a specific house. But this shining of God, this Shekinah glory of God, could come easily and stand over a particular house to guide them to this place. So I think that the star that they saw was God's presence, a shining of the Shekinah glory of God. They saw it in the east. It's aroused their curiosity, led them all that way by faith. They see it again on the way to Bethlehem, and it comes and stands over the place where the child was. So I think that helps us understand this star a little bit better. That fits much better, I think, in the context. Now, another traditions have to do with the wise men. How many wise men were there? Tradition says there were 3. And we really get that because of the 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But it never tells us how many there were. We know it's plural, so there's more than one. Evidently, they would have probably had a large entourage with them. It wouldn't have just been these 3 men. These men were very important men from the east, probably maybe priests. Maybe they were the kingmakers in their country. So they would have had a lot of camels, a large retinue traveling with them. And I think that's part of what aroused Herod's fear and his suspicion. So we don't know how many there were. There were more than one. In fact, in history, they've been given 3 names: Balthazar, Gaspar, and Melchior. One of them is a younger man, one's middle-aged, and one's older. So a lot of traditions have arisen around them. But another point about the wise men is, when did the wise men come? When did they come? Well, we know they weren't there at the manger the night that Jesus was born. And you say, well, how do we know that? Well, in Luke chapter 2, it tells us when they came to visit Jesus, Mary and Joseph and Jesus were living in a house. Mentions a house they were living in. It wasn't a stable. Also, the word that's used for Jesus being a baby is a different word than Luke's gospel and Matthew's gospel when the wise men come. It's a little bit older child. I think another point that's very important about this, remember in Luke chapter 2, Joseph and Mary traveled to Jerusalem for Mary to undergo the ceremony of purification. And that took place for a male child when he was 40 days old. So Jesus at 40 days, they go there when Jesus is about 6 weeks old. And remember, Mary and Joseph don't offer a lamb and a turtle dove or a pigeon. They offer the sacrifice of the poor, which was 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. If Joseph and Mary had already received the gifts from the wise men, they would have certainly given the best offering they could have given. So I believe that that's evidence that the wise men came at least 6 weeks after Jesus was born. And a lot of church tradition says maybe as much as a year later. Also, remember, Herod has all the babies 2 and under killed, the baby boys. Well, if the wise men came and Jesus was just a few weeks old, he could have killed all the babies a year and under, and he would have been sure to kill Jesus. But it's 2 years and under. So that gives evidence again that they came at some point later. So we don't know exactly when they came. According to the Eastern Church, Jesus was born on January 6th. And the wise men came a year later, on that day to visit Jesus. But we do know they weren't in the stable or the cave that first night when Jesus was born with Joseph and Mary and Jesus and the shepherds who visited there. Well, that's enough on this teaching for now. Those are just some of these things. I'm going to get into a few other points though in our subscriber section. We're going to go to the subscriber section, answer a few really great questions from endtimes.com subscribers. If you'd like to access this, you can go to endtimes.com and sign up to be a subscriber. It's $7 a month. I think it'll be an investment that you'll really value greatly. And so I'm going to answer a few more of these questions about Christmas. How do we know the day that Jesus was born? And what about the year Jesus was born? Jesus, it seems like, was born actually BC. So you say, well, how was Jesus born before Christ? So how does all this calendar work? And we'll answer a few of these other questions as well. Well, let's go ahead and dive right into these questions that have been sent in. One question, this is kind of a little bit of a carryover from what I was just talking about earlier, is a very important question about where was Jesus born? Now, you ask anybody who's read the Bible, they're going to say Jesus was born in Bethlehem, right? Because Luke's gospel in Luke chapter 2 tells us Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. And also in Matthew's gospel, in Matthew chapter 2, you remember the wise men come and they come to Herod, they come to Jerusalem. That's where they think a Jewish king would be born. And Herod calls in all the Bible scholars of that day, the Jewish scholars. And they say that the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem Ephratah, because that was spoken of by Micah the prophet. 700 years earlier, Micah in Micah 5:2 predicted the Jewish Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. But notice it's not just any Bethlehem, it's Bethlehem Ephratah. There are actually 2 Bethlehems in that day in Israel. There was a Bethlehem up in Galilee in northern Israel, and there was a Bethlehem down near Jerusalem known as Bethlehem Ephratah. Ephratah means fruitful. So it'd be kind of like today, if you said Springfield, someone would say, well, do you mean Springfield, Illinois, or Springfield, Missouri? So Matthew is clarifying there, and the scholars were, it's Bethlehem Ephratah, down there in the southern part of Israel. That's how specific the Bible is in its prophecies. But a lot of scholars today believe, and they'll say that Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem. They'll say, these writers of the New Testament just did that to have Jesus fulfill this prophecy, that Jesus was really born in Nazareth, which is where he was brought up. You say, well, where do they get that from? Well, they'll point out that in Mark's gospel, Bethlehem's never mentioned. Well, Mark doesn't have a birth narrative of Jesus. He doesn't have a story about Jesus' birth. And Mark will mention that Jesus was from Nazareth. So what a lot of scholars will say is they'll say, look, when you read a lot in the Gospels, it'll say Jesus of Nazareth. So Jesus was from Nazareth. He was born there. He wasn't born in Bethlehem. Well, a couple of things about that. One is, first of all, these modern scholars, they don't know. They weren't there. We're 2,000 years later now. How can we go back and change what these early writers said who actually were there and talked to people who were there? Remember, Luke at the beginning of his gospel says that he made careful investigation of all these things. Luke probably interviewed Mary and talked with Mary. She would have been alive during that time. He would have talked to her and gotten his information from her and others about what happened. So Luke was there and talked to the original eyewitnesses, and he knows that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. But you say, well, why does it say in other places that calls him Jesus of Nazareth? Well, Jesus was from Nazareth. It's where he grew up. Let me just give you this illustration. When I was attending Dallas Theological Seminary, both of our sons were born in Dallas. But when our older son was almost 3 and our younger son was about 6 months old, we moved to Edmond, Oklahoma. Well, if you were to ask either one of my sons, where are you from? They'd say, I'm from Edmond, Oklahoma. They wouldn't say I'm from Dallas. They would be of Edmond. And so it's the same way with Jesus. He was born in Bethlehem, lived there for a brief period of time. His family fled to Egypt. Then they went back to Nazareth, and that's where he grew up. So the gospel accounts are clear. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but then later on he lived in Nazareth, so he could be said to be of there as well. Now here's a question that someone sent in. Again, kind of related to Christmas. This is our theme here. It says, I've been watching a video series about the pagan roots of Christmas and other holidays, and I'm appalled at how we have not been taught this in church. Is it wrong for Christians to celebrate the birth of Jesus on December 25th, which is a day adopted from pagan holiday celebrations? Should we avoid using pagan traditions in our worship? Well, let me just say a few things about that. There's a lot. I've heard about this all my life as well, that, December 25th is associated with pagan holidays and festivals, and, Jesus probably wasn't born that day. We don't know for sure when Jesus was born, but it could have been December 25th. Let me give you a little bit of information about this. The first real credible source to say that Jesus was born December 25th was a man named Hippolytus of Rome. He was a bishop there in Rome, and he said this in about 220 AD. So about 200 years after the birth of Jesus, Hippolytus of Rome clearly says Jesus was born on December 25th. Another man named John Chrysostom in 386 AD said that December 25th is the correct date. And so that's been the date in the Western Church that's been really celebrated ever since then. But a lot of people will say, well, December 25th was associated with all these ancient pagan rituals, like a ritual called Saturnalia, and there was also a feast of the sun god Sol. Well, neither one of those Saturnalia was not celebrated on December 25th that early in Roman history. If the feast of the sun god Sol was never celebrated that early. And Saturnalia never was. But this feast of the sun god Sol was later, after Hippolytus of Rome said that Jesus was born on December 25th. So he really wouldn't have been influenced by these pagan holidays at that time. Now, certainly there's things that have come up through Christmas trees and all these kinds of things that weren't part of the original Christmas. Now, we don't know for sure the day that Jesus was born, but it probably was actually in midwinter. The people I've read, the most reliable scholars, believe it was probably in December or January. Now, one of the arguments against that always is people will say, well, shepherds didn't have their flocks out in the fields at night in the winter. There's a really good book by one of my professors at Dallas Seminary named Harold Hoehner. And Dr. Hoehner deals with a lot of these chronological details. And this is really good. He says, it's true that during the winter months, the sheep were often brought in from the wilderness. But Luke's narrative states that the shepherds were around Bethlehem rather than in the wilderness, thus indicating that Christ's birth was in the winter months. So they were brought closer to Jerusalem and brought in these winter months, and that's exactly what you have here. And also, some writings called the Jewish Mishnah imply that sheep around Bethlehem were outside all year. So actually, the facts fit the idea of a midwinter birth for Jesus, probably sometime in December or January. But kind of going back to the original question, these kind of pagan things that kind of come up around Christmas. To me, the day that we celebrate Christmas is not important. As believers, we have to celebrate Christ's incarnation, his death, and his resurrection every day. Every day for a believer ought to be Christmas, Good Friday, and Easter, as we think about God coming into the world to die for us and be raised from the dead. But if our culture, certain times of the year, like at Christmas, focus on the birth of Jesus, and we can leverage that and use that in our churches and in talking with people to focus people on who Jesus really is and why he came, then I think we ought to seize upon that. So I don't think there's anything wrong with celebrating Christmas and doing that on December 25th. Again, we don't know the exact date, but that's probably as good a date as any. And very early on, Hippolytus of Rome thought it was. So I don't see a problem with that. I mean, some of you may disagree with me on that, and that's okay. But I think we ought to leverage these times of year we can for the gospel. Well, another question that's been asked. Again, we'll move on from the Christmas theme now to a few of these other questions. One person says, based on Zechariah 13, 8, and 9, will 2/3 of the Jewish people die in the tribulation period and not know Jesus before dying? The answer to that question is yes. It talks about how in Israel, during this time of tribulation in Zechariah 13, 2/3 will be cut off. So the tribulation period is going to be a terrible time of trouble for the whole world, but especially for the Jewish people. I mean, it's called in Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 7, the time of Jacob's trouble. So it's going to be a time of great trouble for the descendants of Jacob, who are the Jewish people. It's going to be globally, obviously, a terrible time, but it's going to be a terrible time. They're going to be persecuted by the Antichrist during that time as well. So yes, that's a sad thing to think about. A lot of these Jewish people being gathered to Israel today, 2/3 will be cut off, and they won't know Jesus before dying. But when Jesus returns at his second coming, according to the previous chapter, Zechariah 12 tells us that they're going to look upon him whom they've pierced. God is going to pour out upon them a spirit of grace and supplication. They'll look upon the one they pierced. They'll mourn for him like one mourns for an only son. So God will ultimately bring about a great turning of the Jewish people to himself at the second coming when Jesus returns. One other question here says, and I think this is probably addressed to Jimmy Evans, but I'll answer this as well. It says, you said that every word of the Bible was written by Jews. However, Luke was a Gentile physician and a Greek, right? What are your thoughts about this? Well, it is true that Luke did write a lot of the New Testament. In fact, Luke wrote more of the New Testament than anybody else. In Luke and Acts, now Paul, writes 13 books, but in Luke and Acts, you have more words in those two books than any other of the writers in the New Testament. And it is true that Luke was a Gentile and a physician. We have to remember, though, that Luke got his information primarily from Jews. He says at the beginning of his gospel, that he made careful investigation of these things. And he talked to Mary and many others. He traveled with the Apostle Paul, who was a Jew, and probably got a lot of his information from Paul as well. So technically, you're right here. I mean, Luke's a Gentile physician and a Greek, and he did write most of the New Testament, or the greatest part of it. But he did receive his input and his information from Jews. So I think we can kind of balance that out with that thought as well. One final question here. This is a great question for any time of year. But what are the questions I should ask and observe when choosing a good Bible-based church? Really good question to ask. Let me just mention a few things. Again, others may have other things would come to mind, but here's a few thoughtful points to remember. One, I'd read their doctrinal statement. They should have a doctrinal statement. Now, some groups or denominations have a doctrinal statement that they don't follow anymore. So you want to make sure they actually follow it, but I would at least read that. That's a good starting point. I would get online. Most churches now are online or streaming it, and I would maybe watch a service online or listen to it online. And listen to the sermon, watch the music, just see what the church is like, and find out are they teaching the Bible and really preaching the Word of God, and is the ministry there Christ-centered? Is it gospel-centered? Is it Bible-centered? That's what you want to find in a church. That's the most important thing, is for it to be centered on Jesus Christ. I remember years ago, one of my professors at Dallas Seminary, he used to say that when he would go in a church, there were two things he would look for that could be a dead giveaway. One is how the people how they would sing, and did people bring their Bibles to church? Now, I know a lot of people today, bring their phone or some other electronic device to look at, but those are still two pretty good benchmarks, I think. How do the people sing? Because one of the evidences that we're Spirit-filled is that we sing. You find that in Ephesians chapter 5. And also that people bring their Bibles, that they're hungry for God's Word. I would also look at it, is the church multi-generational? I think it's important to have a church where there's young families there, and there's believers that are older, and we can minister to one another, and we can learn from each other in the different generations. Also, is it a church where there's grace and love there as well? Certainly we want truth, We have to have the truth, but we also want there to be a culture there of grace in a church where there's forgiveness and kindness, and where people really love one another, and it's healthy. And then I'd say maybe in some ways one of the main things as well is just pray. Pray and seek the guidance of the Holy Spirit to lead you to the right place. Think about this. God wants you to be in the right church more than you want to be there. So if you ask him and you're honest and you really want to be there, God will help you find a place that can help you grow spiritually and come to know him in a deeper way. Well, as always, again, thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for subscribing. We'll see you again next time. God bless you.